Good evening. Good evening. We're going to start now. Good evening. We're going to start. It's a very full house. It's a super full house, in fact. So thank you everyone for coming. My name is Rajiv Deheja. I'm a professor of economics and public service at NYU's Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. And I'm the co-director of the Development Research Institute, alongside my colleagues William Easterly and Yao Narco from the Department of Economics. The Development Research Institute seeks to expand the number and diversity of serious commentators on economic development and to have a positive impact on the lives of the poor, who deserve the benefit of high-quality economic research applied to the problems of world poverty. As part of this mission, we're privileged to host leading scholars on economic development working at the frontiers of knowledge. We're thrilled to have with us this evening Esther Duflo, Abdul Latif Jamil Professor of Poverty Alleviation and Development Economics at MIT and co-director of JPAL. And of course, one of this year's Nobel Laureates in Economics. Esther, this is a significant understatement, but congratulations. We were very pleased to host another of this year's Nobel laureates, Michael Kramer, at our annual conference this year. And I'm sure Abhijit Banerjee is with us in spirit as the co-author of the book we're helping to launch at this event tonight. Esther will be in conversation with Debra Dre, Julius Silver Professor in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Economics, talking about her new book with Abhijit Banerjee, Good Economics for Hard Times, among many other things, I'm sure. But first, it is my privilege to turn the floor over to my distinguished colleague, Sibel Raver, Deputy Provost of New York University and Professor of Applied Psychology at NYU's Steinhardt School, for an official welcome on behalf of the university.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Sibel Raver, and I serve as Deputy Provost for the university. And it's on my great pleasure, as well as on behalf of the President and the Provost of the university, to welcome you all here today and to welcome Esther Duflo. It's just a really wonderful opportunity to have a chance to bring together the university, specifically on topics of inequality, equity, and opportunity. This is actually a university-wide initiative to focus on those foci, and it's particularly an honor and a pleasure to have this speaker here today. And many congratulations to Professor Yao Narco and to Rajiv Deheja, and as well as to Bill Easterly for their leadership of DRI. The Provost is extremely pleased to support the Development Research Institute for all that it does, and we are just very, very appreciative of this kind of planning and organizing on behalf of the university and bringing together this group and also this distinguished speaker. So congratulations to all. Thanks.
Thank you, Sibel. I'm tempted to share with you just a small fraction of Esther's many accomplishments, prizes, and distinctions. But even a modest sliver of that list would take quite a while, so I'm not going to do that because I would just take time away from tonight's conversation, which is why we're here. You all know Esther's work and the defining contributions she's made in the field of economics and development research. That's why we're all here. So I'm going to stand aside and turn the floor over to Debra Dre and Esther Duflo.
Does this work? Okay. Good evening, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, meet economist extraordinaire, intrepid innovator, creator and co-director of a network which extends to every corner of the developing world, JPAL, winner of the 2019 Nobel Prize in Economics. And because words are now failing me, I'll have to say kick-ass, badass social scientist, Esther Duflo. Esther, welcome. Okay, we know this is supposed to be a book launch, but I know that I know many of my students are here, and I think this is a great occasion to chat about you a little bit, and there's enormous interest. So I want to start by asking you a little bit about how you got to where you are now. Now, that's obviously a tall question, so I'll tell you what I'm thinking about. My thoughts go back to many years ago when you asked me that you were going to India and is there a place that you could stay with? And you ended up staying with my parents in Shantiniketan. Neither my parents nor I knew exactly what you were up to, but I think we have a better idea now. So I just wanted to get a sense of how did you start? How did it all start for you, development economics?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. Thank you for having me here, the Brads for working together for so long, Bill for launching this institute. So it has been a great force in the discussion and development. And now for your question. So I was not cut out to be an economist. I was not planning to be an economist. I'm French. I grew up reading social history and sociology and thinking myself of a revolutionary and wanting to make the world a better place. And my first foray into economics were enough to convince me that economics was an elaborate hoax to justify the world just as it was. So that convinced me that there was really no point to the whole thing. And so that was the beginning and the end of my economics career in the same year. But that left me a little bit bereft because I still wanted to change the world and I didn't know quite how to get about it. So I thought maybe I should become a civil servant. But I thought let me take 1 year off and think about it. So I went to Russia for 1 year. And in Russia, I met several people. First, I met actually people who were working for Jeff Sachs. So that's a long line. And I ended up being the research assistant of Jeff Sachs, who at the time was not saving Africa, but was saving Russia. And I came to see firsthand how influential economists can be. And that was the first thing. And the second person I met was Thomas Piketty, who told me, he was at the time an assistant professor at MIT, and he told me, economics at MIT, it's not what you think it is. It's much more applied, and it's much more directly in touch with the problems of the world. So putting the two and two together, I thought, maybe actually there is something to this economics thing, and let me give it a try. And that's how I arrived at MIT. And then I arrived at MIT, and I took development. And who was teaching development but Abhijit and Michael Kramer. So as you can imagine, I was learning from the best that were available, at least at MIT, and it was really wonderful for any number of reasons. So you will be sensitive to that, but one of the first papers we read was Dasgupta and Ray. I don't know if you know these guys. Yeah. And what was really, and I was like, it's about, land reform could actually make people more productive. So economists doesn't always see a trade-off between equity and efficiency. And then they covered the Barga paper, where they would show that in another example, in practice, in reality, when you actually do give more power to the tenant, it makes them more productive. And then they did the sugar cooperative paper, which you might also know a little bit. And then I remember one of my friends was that this is all within the first 3 months of being a graduate student at MIT. And a French friend of mine was visiting me, and I said, these guys, they're like the snakes inside the economics profession. They are going to change it from inside. And my friend told me, they are going to change you from inside. And I don't know what happened, but one of the two happened, and we're still together. So that's kind of how I became a development economics very, very quickly after my arrival to MIT.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, if Esther's read me, then all my students should be reading me for their exams. Okay. I wanted to go push a little deeper because you've worked in so many places all over the world, and I know one of your earliest work was on utilizing the idea of school construction in Indonesia, right? And I wanted you to speak maybe a little bit to the students here in the audience that where would you place the importance of actually living in your setting or being there, working in a developing country as opposed to on it, right? Is there a forest for the trees problem? How do you feel about that?
So I think one of the great value of doing randomized control trials is that it forces you to go to the field. You might think you don't have to do a randomized control trial to go to the field. After all, NYU DRI was going to the field before any of us was doing randomized control trial, and he learned an enormous amount, I think, from his setting. But there is no, if you're doing randomized control trials, there is no alternative. You have to be in the field, and you have to understand what is going on there. And I would say, I do see your point of forest for the tree, but I would say there is no substitute to understanding what is going on, because otherwise we all live in a world of intuitions. These intuitions, as economists, they are so built inside us that I don't think we even necessarily recognize them as the product of assumptions and the product of our education as human beings, and also as economists. And I think until you're confronted to how it plays out in people's life, I don't think you have the possibility to free you from this intuition. It doesn't mean you can't do good work occasionally, and it doesn't mean that you always have to go to the field to do good work. But I think being a development economist without spending time in the field, you might just sort of skirt around reality without ever going there.
Yeah. So actually, there's something I wanted to ask you about this, which is the conceptual basis from which you started. And I go back to a beautiful paper of yours with Abhijit called Growth Theory Through the Lens of Development Economics, written many years ago is not appropriate for Esther, but some years ago, let's say. Everything seems to have happened very quickly. But you seem to have returned to that theme in your book in some way, in the sense that a lot of the book is about the notion of misallocation, right? And so just for the audience here, we can think of, when you're thinking about economic growth or economic development, you can think of people saving a lot, investing a lot, and the economy growing for that reason. Or you could think of the economy putting its house in order, allocating resources correctly within any particular year so as to then generate a large increase in output. And what was interesting about Esther and Abhijit's work is that they focused on this misallocation problem, which reappears again and again in this book that I hope many of you will read. So tell us a little bit about your feelings about misallocation as opposed to the standard growth remedies of saving and investment and so forth.
So the way that we think about growth, if we think about it from a macro perspective, we think about there is capital, and then there is labor, and maybe there is human capital. But obviously, when Solo was writing this model, he was not thinking that there is like one big machine and then there is one worker. The only reason you can think about the stock of capital is you think that all of the resources willy-nilly go back to their most efficient use, and therefore the rate of return get equalized across all the use, and the rate of return to physical capital and human capital and labor gets equalized. And that, again, go back to what I was saying about assumption being, we become so ingrained in us that we just forget their assumptions. I don't think Solo ever forgot these were assumptions. Sure. But certainly growth proceeded with taking that as a thing, like this is happening, and then being very puzzled that, Lucas said, being very puzzled that capital doesn't go from India from the US to India. Well, it doesn't go from like one side of Tirupur to the other side of Tirupur. So you have no reason why you should be puzzled about that. So as development economists, and in particular working from the micro side, you cannot but see that a fundamental thing that is happening is that resources are not flowing to their best users. That within the same city, within the same industry, you have people who are unable to borrow, and you have people who are sitting on piles of cash that they don't really know quite what to do with. And a lot of development, not just our work, but the work of a lot of the field, is about explaining, well, quantifying and explaining all of these reasons for misallocation of physical capital, of resources, etc. And what we are trying to do in this book, and we are in this chapter, and we were doing it at the same time as the macroeconomists were also coming at it from their macro angle, is to say, well, actually, this is quantitatively really important, and quantitatively probably more important than anything we can say about, in general, where the frontier of innovation is located, etc., because these things are totally first order. And since then, the field of macro has really taken that on. I don't think we played much of a role in that, but it happened anyway, which is great, and trying to incorporate these ideas that resources don't flow to their best use and understand why, etc., and become more and more sophisticated about measuring it and taking implication from it. And in this book, in the current book, we go back to it because it's so important to also understand what is happening to the developing country after a while, for example, to India now, because you can grow, if you start from a complete mess, which is...
A stupendous mess is what you call it.
which is maybe what the Indian economy started from several decades ago, and you do even a little bit of putting the house in order, then you have enormous amount of growth. But then once that is done, then growth is going to slow down. It's not bad per se. It's just that, and that explains why you could have, that it's not the only reason, but that would create an economy that gives the impression to be on a rocket ship, which suddenly will slow down. So,
but there's, when you read this book, as I hope you will, there's a very interesting twist in that tale. So the twist of the tale comes with the following. So she's talking about misallocation. There's a lovely chapter there called The Pains from Trade, which is, I guess, a riff on the gains from trade, right? And talking about how people have been unable to move out of certain sectors when, let's say, hit by the China shock or large exports from developing countries, right? So one can almost understand here that she's talking about misallocation, how this can affect so negatively developed economies. But then starts a wonderful section which says, the title is, Don't Start That Trade War. Now, the reason that there's a twist in the tale is because you would imagine that if trade is having bad effects, then an obvious conclusion to that would be to start a trade war and stop trade, right? As our great leader at the moment seems to be doing, right? But then there's this section. So how does this reconcile itself? So it reconciles itself in a very interesting way that I want Esther to talk about. It's a little bit like you cannot push on a string. So namely, if you've had trade, it's had a lot of bad effects. The way of undoing that is not to undo trade, because the two bad sets of effects are not going to cancel out, right? So this notion of irreversibility, that if trade has already created a bad situation, that just by imposing tariffs, you can recover the earlier days, is not something that's on the cards. Tell us a little bit about that. I like that part of your book.
Yeah, so what we kind of insist, what's a bit a running theme of the book, and that's related to the notion of misallocation, is to take seriously the cost of transition, that it is much more difficult than we typically assume as economists for people to move physically from one place to another. And this is why not everybody from the whole world is trying to come to the US, contrary to other fear of the great leader. And and it's also difficult to change sector, and it's difficult to change career, and for any number of reasons. Some of them purely material, like for example, if you are underwater on your mortgage, then you cannot just go live elsewhere, because where are you going to live? And for reasons that I think are also just as rational, but more deeply human, like our need to belong to a social network, to have a position in the social network, to have someone to take care of our children, and also the sense of meaning that we are putting in the job that we are doing. So for all these reasons, it's much, much harder for people to move from one occupation or one place to another place. Hence the pain from trade, because what happens if you lose your job in North Carolina making furniture is that it's not so easy to pack up and go to New York to sell furniture, even though that was kind of the natural things that we would expect people to do. That means that, contrary, in a standard economic model, you would expect that the low-skilled worker in rich country would be somewhat negatively affected by trade, but we can compensate them, in principle. But here, it's not the abstract low-skilled worker whose wage goes down a little bit. It's a specific person or the member from a specific community that get hurt a lot. Now, if you decide, okay, let's just put trade barrier, then say the people, and you stop importing steel from China, then the people who are making the car that are running on the steel, they are going to lose their job. Mm-hmm. Then what? They are going to have to go through the same transition. You are not making Mr. Furniture maker happier by making Mr.
There's no cancellation.
Steel worker. There is no cancellation, because it's not that, maybe they would be in a model where everybody smoothly went
Correct.
away. If that was the source of the problem, then you could cancel out by saying, oh, we will. But it's not the case in a world where the problem is transition. So if the problem is transition, then what you need is to do something that economists don't like to do, and there are reasons why I don't like to do it. I appreciate the difficulty of doing it, but it's to identify the loser and help them out. Because actually we know who gets hurt. Mm. And in fact, we can even predict it to some extent.
Right, so I guess by now you're seeing a little bit of where Esther is coming from. So again, for the students, nothing is cast in stone. Nothing is axiomatic, right? Even something as simple as migrating from one sector to another is not simple, because prices don't get equalized, right? People can get stuck. And two versions of stuck doesn't mean unstuck. They could mean doubly stuck, right? Which is what she's talking about. So I want to sort of go into that a little bit more, talk to you a little bit more about this. It seems now, this is maybe a little bit of my own psychology in your place, but I'm thinking, I think you're interested in behavioral economics. She's written a beautiful paper with Michael Kremer and Jonathan Robinson on why people don't use fertilizer right. It seems, it's not very expensive to do it. It's not like some external constraint like absence of loans or lack of access to a credit market. It seems to be some sort of internal constraint that's not making people take the right decisions, right? So I wanted to ask you, did you get interested in behavioral economics because it somehow echoes your deep suspicion about the smooth functioning of markets, of individual rationality and so forth? Is that your entry point into behavioral, or is there something else?
So my entry point in behavioral economics is really, I guess that's probably the answer to that is yes, but it's really the answer to what I found on the field in some sense. Because you take this example, I think my first behavioral paper was probably the paper you're talking about with fertilizer. And I didn't set out to write a paper integrating psychology and economics. I had never taken a behavioral economics course or a psychology course, but I was spending a lot of time in Kenya working on HIV at the time, and I got interested in this fertilizer issue because it was really striking to me that everybody was growing maize, where the fertilizer technology has been around forever and ever and ever, and is quite simple, and people weren't using it. And when you ask people, we just spend time around in the farms, and they're saying this because they don't have money. And so as a development economist trained into credit constraint, you say, yes, they don't have money, of course, that makes perfect sense, until you're like, can you buy the fertilizer in small quantity?
Yes.
Yeah, we can. We can just go and buy whatever, as little as you want. And is it far to get it? No, it's like right at the corner store. And so you think, well, that's not a credit constraint because you don't need credit to buy 3 grams of fertilizer. You can save, you can drink like 2 cups of tea less, and bang, you have the money for the fertilizer. So then it has to be something else. And that's kind of what got us to think about what it could be. So in a sense, that's in response to a situation that I saw in the field. That goes back to your question of the importance to spend time in the field.
Right.
That I went back, and then, of course, you use the tools that you don't go and start reinventing the wheel. Then you use the tool that exists and see whether that can fit in a reasonably, in that case, standard model of time inconsistent preferences, and explain it this way. So in a lot of my work, there is this interplay between what you discover in the field, which can come from an experiment or can come, like in this case, from a purely descriptive discovery. By the way, before getting puzzled about why people are not using fertilizer, we spent about a couple of years checking that actually there were positive returns to using fertilizer.
Correct.
Because maybe there is no puzzle because people don't using properly, so it's really not a good technology for them. So before we could really allow ourselves to be puzzled, we had to rule out like option one. Right. And then in the process, looked at whether people were learning from each other, which they didn't seem to be learning much from each other, to our surprise, which also launched another set of interests of mine, which are on social networks and what kind of information diffuses or don't diffuse, which again I got to and got interested into because of that experience in the field. So there is a descriptive fact which sometimes take a lot of time to even establish, but then in isolation it's not easy to process. So then it goes back to the background that exists in economics and whatever you need to read to make sense of it. And then you can go back to the field with a very specific, in my case, an experimental design in mind, to kind of test the explanation that at this point makes the most sense for me. And most of the time it's wrong anyway, because it's not because it makes sense to me that it's correct. But sometimes you sometimes you get to something.
Good, okay, so, hold that thought, because we're going to come back to that for a second, this notion of people making right decisions or not, because I want to go on to another part of the book. So we are sort of going a little bit through the book here, which is another part where I found very interesting, because I sort of work on it myself, the idea of universal basic income. Okay? So for those of you who may not know what universal basic income is, the idea is to carry out redistributive policies or transfer policies which give citizens a fixed amount of cash and let them do whatever it is that they want to do with it, rather than something that says, okay, we'll give you cash if you send your kids to school, we'll give you cash if you send your kids for a medical checkup, no conditionalities. The assumption about universal basic income is that people know best what's best for them, okay? So now, it's interesting, in this chapter, I would have thought that Abhijit and Esther were going to dump on universal basic income for the reasons that we've just discussed, right? But what's interesting is that actually they set up, they talk about how universal basic income is actually pretty wide, in the few experiments that we know, that it's actually pretty wisely used by people. They don't blow it on alcohol. They don't blow it on tobacco, right? They blow it on food. They seem to blow it on the right stuff, right? And so they make, I won't say that they make an enthusiastic case for universal basic income, but they make a tentative and reasonably considered case for it. Now this is slightly at odds with the behavioral perspective that we were discussing before, that people may not know what's best for them. Explain.
First of all, I don't think you should say they blow it on food. Because I think they wisely spend it on getting the food that they and their kids need. Actually, I don't think it goes against. So first of all, I think there is nothing. The poor have no more behavioral biases than the rich.
Sure.
We share we share some common behavioral distortion. Then on some issues, the poor are much more sophisticated than the rich. For example, I'll give you an example of that. a mistake that people very frequently do is to confuse absolute amount and proportional amount. So if I tell you there is an iPhone, you can get it for $15, it's $1,000, but you can get it $15 off if you go like 5 T-stop away. People are like, no, that's not worth it. Or if I tell you there is a shirt, it's $15, or it's $30, but you can get it for $15 3 T-stop away, people move for that. So that's, of course, they shouldn't, because what they should compare is the opportunity cost of their time and the train ticket plus the $15, not the ratio to the price. Anyway, the poor don't make that mistake. So because they are much more aware, actually, of the value of the money. And so if anything, the poor are much more sophisticated about money than the rich. However, the poor, so our societies are much more organized to protect ourselves against our own failings. So we tend to have wages, money for our retirement tend to be taken away from these wages. We have health insurance if we are working in a university anywhere. Immunization schedule is compulsory, etc. So we get a series of things that protect us, which is inexistent in a country that is mostly still spectacularly disorganized like India. So that means that the behavioral issues become more salient for the poor just because the safeguards are not placed. In addition, just the fact of being poor means that, and that's the work of Sendil Mulaneta and Eldar Shafir, makes you...
And Anandi Mani.
And that, yeah, on the
book.
On the book by them too, and based on this article by the Tree, makes you so obsessed about getting that right that you cannot get other things right. And subsequent to this, to their initial work, there is work showing, for example, that if you give people a bit more money, for example, through a UBI, there is a
UBI is
universal basic income, or in the case of Abhijit, as a paper where it's you give people an asset, and then you give them a job. They actually, not only do they work less on the job, do they not work less on the job, they work as many hours on the job, debunking the idea that the welfare recipients are lazy. They just work just as hard, except that they are much more focused on the job and they make fewer mistakes, and therefore they are actually more productive on the job. So actually having, here behavioral economics would very much go in favor of the value of having an insured livelihood no matter what. Other way in which this would go is if you believe this scarcity idea, this idea that once you're worried about money, you can't be thinking about your kids' immunization and other things because you're all obsessed about, am I going to be able to repay the grocer tonight? Then that means that if we avoid that, then people will be able to focus their energy on this other, and their mental energy on these other issues, and will be less trapped into the behavioral biases that they might otherwise get. So I think for a very poor country, being able to guarantee at least, we call it very basic income, because if you wanted to make it available for everybody and do other things that government might want to do, it can't be large. But be able to guarantee a minimum level of sustenance, maybe that people would need to access when they need it, which would help auto-screen a bunch of people who don't need it at a given point in time, would actually go a very long way towards alleviating a lot of the behavioral biases that impede the poor in their lives. So to me, behavioral economics would go in, everything I know about it until now, would go in the direction of just giving the money. We have a slightly different take on the rich countries. On the rich countries, first of all, a very basic income is not going to help, because that's not going to be enough. It's not enough. It's not what people expect to be able to survive on, so it would be pretty expensive. The way that Andrew Young speaks about $13,000 a year, which is, if you wanted to pay for it, you would have to either raise taxes a lot or slash a lot of other benefits. And second, this is the discussion I was having before about meaning. People need to do something with their lives. So not just being given money is not going to give people a sense that they have achieved something. It's not going to make them lazy, as far as we can see from all the evidence that exists, but it's not going to satisfy them either. So then you're not really solved your problem. And in addition, if I'm right about the transition problem, we sort of know who needs help. And we could spend a lot more money on meaningfully helping people whose jobs have been destroyed for no fault of their own, getting back onto like a career, getting an employment, getting a UBI for them, which would not be universal anymore, getting a basic income guaranteed for enough time, giving them serious tuition credit that they can actually learn something new and pick up on something else. That costs money. So to me, it's kind of makes sense to concentrate the resources towards those who really need it, rather than to spread it thinly across many people who are doing very fine. Thank you very much.
You got it. So I know you guys are probably dying to ask some questions, right, Rajiv? So I'm going to just ask Esther one more thing about her book, and then turn it over to you guys, and which is the conclusion. The last line of the book, which is the last sentence, is, "Economics is too important to be left to economists." Did you write that, or Abhijit? Oh, okay. Both of you wrote that with your hands intertwined.
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. But, the trend in the social sciences appears to be the opposite, which is that the social sciences are too important to be left to non-economists, or at least a lot of economists seem to feel that way. This has spawned a little area which is known as economic imperialism. My students know about this in class, which is that economists love going into every field and making a nuisance of themselves, okay? And sometimes, with good effect. So I wanted to ask Esther, we were at a conference together at Northwestern, and Esther gave this talk on, wait for this, math education for kids. What has math education got to do with economics? But there was Esther, right, talking about math education. So I want to ask you, how far have you strayed after saying that economics is too important to be left to economists? How far have you strayed beyond the boundaries of what's commonly thought of as economics? And do you like it?
Yes, I don't know, maybe economics tend to be what economists do at a point in time. I think that's a good definition of it. So, but that work that you talked about actually is was done jointly with a cognitive scientist, bona fide cognitive scientist at Harvard, and my job in that particular project is to really keep the trains running on time. And the way that, so I don't really consider this project to be economics. It's, we publish in Science or in Psychology Journal, and I'm just, I'm kind of running the show on the logistic front, because my co-author is an absolutely wonderful person who had never gone out of her lab. So at some point, I thought maybe the same thing, that cognitive psychology is too important to be left to cognitive psychologists, because I actually read the way this project came about, and that, again, I will tell you a little bit how I go about things in a somewhat not very systematic way. I learned about her, so someone joked to me that the moment people have kids, they become super interested in early childhood development. So that happened to me. Having a very small kid, I read this article about this wonderful work by Liz Pelke, who understood how to speak to baby, and I came to know about her work, about how kids learn mathematics and what kids know about math, and I thought, wow, you could use that to really build a preschool curriculum to prepare children to learn mathematics in India or in other developing countries. And you might think, why am I thinking about that, besides the fact that I have a baby myself? I'm thinking about that because I've been working on education now in India. By that time, I'd been working on education in India for 15 years. And I had, this is my first randomized control trial, was a program on remedial education. And then a series of projects with the organization Pratham was all about trying to understand why the Indian education system is performing so badly. Why is it that kids are all going to school and not learning anything in school? And to make a long story short, what became very apparent, and that's not just a problem in India, is that the curriculum is completely inadapted to the kids. That the curriculum is hyper ambitious, that teachers feel responsible only to teach the curriculum if they feel responsible for anything. And they go through the curriculum and the kids are just somewhere else, you know, dreaming something. And a lot of my work has been, once you know that, it's very easy to fix, because it's enough to talk to the kids at the level where they are, and they make spectacular progress. Except that it's been quite hard to get that approach to live inside the system. We are making progress, and we've been working and keep changing the programs to make them in a way that they can live inside the education system. But it's difficult because the idea that you're shortchanging the children if you make the curriculum easier is very, very deeply ingrained. And therefore, I had come to the conclusion that if the curriculum is not coming to them, you have to bring them to the curriculum. And so that's why I wanted some preschool program, and that's how I came to do math education. And I don't have any expertise on it, nor do I claim to have any of it, although it's been really fun to get educated about it. But what I do know is to run an experiment in the field. So I could organize that work. And it's been a wonderful collaboration. Mm-hmm. I think in terms of economics being too important to be left to economists, maybe this is also what this means, is that there are a lot of bits of it that there is a lot of bits of the social science or human behavior, etc., that we are not expert on, we are not aware of, but at some point we stumble into them. And we cannot just say, oh, well, sorry, this is not my territory, let me go back to, you know, maximizing stuff. Correct. Then you have to, you know, get the person who knows what it is they're doing. So in this case, in this example, it was Liz for me.
I mean, to me, this is, you know, this is how interdisciplinary stuff should be done. Interdisciplinary is not just diving into another field. You have to get your ABCs right. Again, I'm talking to my students here. You know, Picasso broke so much ground, but for years he was in the Prado copying Velázquez, right? He knew how to do the classical stuff before he broke it. And I think that's what's great about what Abhijit and Esther do. In any case, I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Notice, by the way, I haven't asked you a single question about randomized controlled trials. Not a word, but maybe there'll be something from the audience. So, shoot away. Go ahead.
Your team won the Nobel Prize based on research based on Nepal and India. Like you also visit to Nepal and you meet with Swarnim Wagle. What is the main cause of poverty in Nepal and what is the solution?
Can I interject here before you start? Guys, go ahead and ask these questions, but she cannot tell you what the main cause of poverty in Nepal is and how you
tell him. There I was. So I do not know what the main cause of poverty in Nepal. I've built a whole career not answering these questions. This is above my pay grade. Let me take the opportunity to say that the way that I think all three of us, Michael, Abhijit, and me, understand this Nobel Prize, it's not for us. So when you said it's built on work in India and Nepal, it's built on work by many people in many countries, and we see it as a prize for a movement that is much, much greater than us. I think if you removed every single of my absolutely brilliant, fantastic papers from my portfolio, you would still have something that's quite, you know, you would still have an amount of work that is, you know, much broader than us, that we were kind of lucky to be in the right place at the right time to be a part of this movement and nurture this movement, and in a sense, no individual project is part of it.
Go ahead, Matt.
I look forward to reading your book, and thank you for honoring the field. My question is about trade and creative destruction. Your focus on the lack of mobility and the losers in regard to trade in developing countries. I'm led to believe by so many studies done on US circumstances that there's a net neutral circumstance to loss from jobs as trade circumstances in regard to the gains from trade of innovation and new job opportunities. Does the developing world look different, and what could be reasons that mobility just being one of the reasons for it, that there is a particular discrepancy between the changeover from what is former circumstances and then new opportunities through growth and innovation?
So what is striking is that, so two things. First of all, again, the gain from someone doesn't cancel the pain to someone else. In particular, because the gains tend to be actually quite widespread. So we all benefit in getting, cheaper, better furniture, but all benefit just a little bit. And we have, as a society, have not really been able to pool our little benefits into serious redistribution to the people who lose actually a lot. Surprisingly, you would think, so in developing country, in fact, the first paper that really started to identify whether some people were relatively hurt from trade. That's always relative because it could be that everybody is richer, but some people are richer faster, less fast than others. In India, when India liberalized trade in '91, first order, what was striking is nothing happened either way. There was no collapse of the Indian economy, as some people had predicted, and there was no huge takeoff because actually the Indian economy had taken off in the 80s. It just continued on its largely upward trajectory. But what was quite striking is that the region that were hit the most by import competition gained less in terms of poverty reduction than the region that were hit less, which is surprising because we tend to think that in a developed country like India, people would benefit from trade. But of course, it says some people's job disappeared, and then there was another job elsewhere, and those people whose job disappeared, they actually didn't move to go get these other jobs. Exactly like in the US, the mobility didn't increase from these regions. The sectoral composition didn't change to accommodate the new composition, the new composition of jobs. And so you have this pretty much the same thing that is happening in the US, maybe a little worse because there are also barriers to, legal regulation that prevents some companies to shut off and others to open. But very much the same thing, the same forces that lead to misallocation are really at the root of what makes the reaction to trade difficult in rich countries and in poor countries, and limit the gains that there could be from trade if people could quickly move to the new opportunities, and worsen the pains that are related to it.
Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
Hi, Esther. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us, and I greatly admire your work, and I do think your work really plays a critical role humanizing the economics in this century. So I am a psychologist and having a long history of working with economists, and you do a lot of work with understanding actually human behavior in the sphere of economics. And what I find really struggling interacting with economists is sort of simplifying human behavior and capacity in a way into just one variable without thinking much through what goes really into capturing in different contexts and culture. And you do a lot of work in different culture and contexts, and I would love to know your thoughts about that and the role of economists in that sphere.
Well, I don't think there is anything wrong with simplifying as long as you are willing to then put your simplification, your assumption to the test. We all simplify the world to make sense of it. Otherwise, I don't think we could put a step in front of the other. So what then you need to do, and it's true that economists tend to simplify maybe more than others, but then what you need to do is to confront this simplification to reality. This is the step that I guess I'm more keen to do in my work than some others.
Yeah, go ahead, at the back. No, you miss, yeah, yeah.
Can I just speak?
Yes, speak.
So thank you so much to both of you. And I really liked what you said. This is easier now. I really liked what you said about how important it is to work in the field when you're talking about economics. So I'm wondering if you could share, do you have any experience in the field that was particularly surprising to you, or a memory that really kind of changed how you saw something about your career that might have been different than it was when you were working on it on a more theoretical level?
It's how much time do you have? Maybe the most striking, every trip is a new kind of eye-opening experience, but maybe the most striking moment was maybe not surprisingly, was the first time that I landed in Kolkata. And I came to Kolkata with all my well-meaning prejudices of middle-class French girl raised on Mother Teresa and Schweitzer. You know, I thought everybody in Calcutta had leprosy and lived under a square meter. And even after 2 years of development economics, at some level, I still thought that. And what was really striking to me when I landed is how prosperous the place was. Not just like the city in general, but even we were working at the time, we were trying to do a project that actually never saw the light of day. But in the context of working on the project, we were spending a lot of time with tailors in Métier-Brouge, which is the kind of a place where people, where they make garment, and they live in like horrible conditions, because the moment that the water, it rains, they live next to canals, they flood. So their houses are constantly flooded, and then all their material floods, and it's kind of a mess, and they're sick all the time and all that. So the conditions were not positive, but I saw the people just, going about their business, like doing their stupid things and their intelligent things and their things in between, and making decisions and kind of trying to make sense of the world around them. And because I came at it with such naivete, with the idea that the poor are so different from me, it was just completely a game changer, that, we are just like doing the same thing, except in different circumstances.
There was a question in front. Yeah, go ahead. Rajiv?
Thank you so much for the very rich conversation. I'm an international development practitioner, and I wanted to say that in the field we have benefited so much from the movement you've driven with randomized control trials, then with the wave of behavioral science and behavioral economics, the role of behavioral design in driving kind of innovative solutions. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think is next in the field of economics that can have this breakthrough influence in the practitioner's world?
I can tell you what I think is next from from where I sit, from my narrow perspective, but I also think that I'm probably not the best place to see it, because probably what is next is somewhere in this room and it's not with me anymore. But I'll tell you what I see, where I see the excitement in the field of development economics now is at least in the empirical part of development economics. One is that, I guess that's more a wish list than something I see, is I wish all of you started working about climate change. So that's more a topic issue than, but the way that economists like to think about it, they more climate change paper than he would have liked, I think, in his career, thanks to me. The way that economists, lots of economists think about climate change is to say, well, it's fine because there is going to be some investment in the green technology that are going to make them so cheap that eventually it's going to be beneficial compared to the fossil fuel technology, and we can continue to consume just as much, except that it will now be green. And I'm into that. If it happens, great. But I don't think we can count on it. I don't think the technology we have is completely sure. On the other hand, I also think that from a development economist, there are really two things. One is happening anyways. So not working on the implication that it has on the poor seems like criminal, because all of the poverty, all of the gains against that we see, that we have seen, real, tangible, important gain in the last 30 years, they are going to go away in Bangladesh if Bangladesh is underwater. So working on what are the implications for the poor countries and how we prepare for the part of the disaster that is going to happen seems to me pretty essential. And the second thing is, I actually do think that we could, probably we should, but also we could consume less. And I think working, that's more, if anybody is not so much interested in development, where I think in developing countries people should consume more because they consume so little today. In rich countries people could and should consume less. And I think that actually it might not even be that costly. Because I think we take again, it's an assumption of economists that more is always better, that more consumption is always better, and that all we like is to eat and eat and eat and be in warmer houses in the winter and in colder houses in the summer until it becomes uncomfortable both places. But in reality, when you see how people live in Europe, it's very different from how they live here, and there is already research showing that people's habit can change, and I think working on preferences, working on how you get, actually not only educate, but get people to start caring about something that is far away and in a long time, and then how you form the habit of lower consumption. I think that's a pretty essential. So that's more a wish list than something I see necessarily happening.
Very good. We have time for one more question. Rajiv, is that correct? Sorry. 2 or 3. Excellent. Okay.
Here.
I'm happy. Oh my God. I don't know. Ma'am, you go first.
Okay, thank you. And I'm not an economist. I'm a journalist. I love reading economics. And my question relates to investment in poor countries. There are many organizations and many people around the world who every day send money to some of the poorest countries with the intention of putting them out of poverty. And in the past 3 months, I tried to study the database of World Bank projects in the poor countries, the evaluation reports. And it shows that nearly 3 out of 10 projects where World Bank invests its money are failing. They are not delivering. And countries where projects are failing, these are the poorest of the poor countries, where you want really to pull people out of poverty. How can these institutions or organizations that are working to develop the poorest of the poor countries do better to ensure that each and every coin which they put in these countries deliver the desired result? Thank you.
So I think that's a bit like a Nepal question, which is if I knew the answer to this question, I would tell you, but I don't. But let me tell you that in a sense, this question of how to make the aid more effective is a little bit besides the point, because most of the money that is being spent on developing on the poor people in developing countries is spent with the budget of the developing countries themselves. So the relevant question is not really how you make the World Bank more effective, although that would be a worthwhile investment, but the real billion-dollar question is how do you make sure that the money that the the countries are spending themselves on the problems that affects them is well spent. And on this, you can't guarantee that every dollar is going to be well spent because one makes mistakes. Policy is done under pressure, and people go fast, and they don't have all the information they need. And what are they going to do? They must operate. So I think hoping that every single dollar is spent perfectly is not the right benchmark. What you should hope is that as much as possible is spent on things that are effective. And on this, I actually do think that there are reasons to be very optimistic for what happened in developing countries over the last 3 decades, because besides the gain, there have been gains in poverty that have not been, that are just to do mainly with economic growth in China and India. But there have also been gains even in very poor countries on the very fundamental aspects of the welfare of the poor, such as a huge reduction in the cases of malaria and death from malaria, such as a halving of infant mortality, such as big reduction in maternal mortality, even in countries which otherwise haven't really becoming richer. And where did it come from? I don't know, it would have to be told, the stories would have to be called countries by countries, but you can pinpoint many cases where it comes from both a policy focus on, okay, let's focus on these problems, that we can actually do things that are going to reduce maternal mortality. We can have ambulances that are bringing people to hospital when there is a complication in the birth. And so a willing to be pragmatic from governments that were before maybe not necessarily focusing on how to solve their problems. And I would say somewhat maybe self-servingly for the movement we were talking about, in more evidence floating about what might work. And therefore a richer toolbox on, okay, this actually might work, putting ambulances might work, giving people birth kits might work, etc., etc. So I think actually there are in a geopolitical context where generally there are not too many reasons to be sanguine, what happened in developing countries over the last 30 years and how many countries, including very poor countries, have managed to make real improvement with their own resources about in the welfare of their poorest member is something that they should be proud about and we can be admiring about.
Great. Yes.
Thank you very much for being here and for this very insightful conversation. My question is about the development and implementation of evidence-based policies in developing countries, which is something that's not done so much, and how the results and the identification of successful interventions through the randomized controlled trials can be used by governments, especially in developing countries, and what are some successful strategies to scale them up?
So that's kind of why we started JPAL, because it's not really so much the forte of economists to do this translation of research into action. And certainly if economics is too important to left to economists, policy making should not be left to economists. But so JPAL actually, so I'll just give you from what I see from JPAL's perspective, which of course is a little bit biased, but it is what it is. So JPAL actually has huge policy teams now. A lot of the staff in JPAL is policy staff. And let me tell you the way it's not working, and maybe the way maybe when I first started, I thought that you evaluate a project, you think it's a good project, and then you start discussing it to various governments and say, look, this isn't, like, that's an option, that's something you could do. And that's actually not really the way, it's not usually the way it has worked. There are some exceptions, like Michael Kramer's deworming project, because in some sense, worms are so biological. I mean, it makes so much sense that if you have worms, it's going to make you sick, and therefore, if I treat the worms, you're going to feel better. So that's one where there was almost a direct connection from the evaluation to a policy recommendation. But in many other cases, it's not really the way it happens. What you learn from a project, from a single project, maybe from a single project is very little. what you learn from a combination of projects, which are either the same project in different contexts, or related projects, which touch at the same problem but from different angles, is more like an insight. And the insight can be then used to design, to think through another program elsewhere, which might not be the one, which not be exactly the one that has been evaluated anywhere before. And so that's kind of how I see. So I don't even know if scale up is the right word, as opposed to kind of adoption of the insight that are, so you're trying to go from projects that are context specific into what am I learning that's a little bit broader. And then once you have that lesson that's a little bit broader and you go back to another context, then how is it going to be embodied into a plausible program for that context? And often then, if it's us who come back and make this type of recommendation, the government we work with always want to do an experiment. And we are, of course, always willing to do experiment. So the process is much more like of, connecting all of the dots of any single program to form a picture of, oh, this looks to be like an important thing. And then using this picture to kind of to be part of a conversation that helps thinking about what is the program that makes sense in that country. So it's kind of a combination of the local context, whatever the political imperative happens to be, and whatever that toolbox of knowledge is.
Yes. Sorry, no, the one. And then you. Yeah, go ahead.
So thank you very much for the conversation. I'm a PhD in economics, and so I'm going to ask a question that is student-oriented in a sense. I really appreciate what you said about interdisciplinarity. And personally, the thing I like the most of economics is really this need to speak different languages, maybe not fluently, but at least to understand other disciplines and other ways of seeing the world sometimes. My question is, in a highly interdisciplinary framework or project, first, what do you think should really be the contribution of the economists? What should we as economists worry about bringing into such a diverse work environment? And second, it could be a daily little practice or a disruptive experience. What would you recommend to do to learn and improve at listening and speaking these different languages really in our daily work?
So my role usually on any project with or without economists is the logistics. So, and I've tend to, for a reason that I don't understand, economics seems to be a little bit better organized than most other disciplines. So that's not a very exciting comparative advantage, but it is one to keep in mind. Usually you're also going to be the person with the best statistical training. So that's another one. That can, so you're going to be the one to remember that, if you randomize at the classroom level and you have 2 classrooms, you do not have an experiment. So that's in other words, that's called nagging. Spoiling the fun of everyone else. Maybe more, I'll tell you more seriously, what I see with the new, is kind of the new generation of experiment in economics among the younger people, so graduate students and junior faculty, tend to run this project that are not anymore evaluating anything that anybody would want to scale up, going back to your question of scaling up. But they are really experiments that are designed with the idea of testing something, testing some idea. So, for example, we were talking about the scarcity idea, and the scarcity in the first paper that Anandi and Sandil and Eldar did. It was not an experiment, but it was comparing before and after harvest. Are people more able to solve IQ puzzles? But then when they wanted to move that to the field and to test whether it was relevant, they set up an experiment where basically you're paying people either at day 8 or at day 13. And then you're looking at whether the people who are paid at day 8 are more productive on their work than what they are paid, than the ones between day 9 and day 12 than the one who would be paid at day 13. And so here you have, you have the interdisciplinarity coming from, ELDA or the psychology part of the work. But the experimental design and thinking about, I'm really simplifying the experimental design because they have all sorts of stuff to check that this is really that and not this and not that. And thinking through all of the intricacy of the experimental design, even if what you're trying to test is a psychology experiment, is something that I think we have a much better training for. So you can that is something that definitely you will be able to bring. Daily practice, what Frank said, Frank Schilbach, who is the economist I know who knows the most psychology, or I interact with very regularly, who knows the most psychology, which is his field, is he reads and reads and reads.
I wonder if there's a psychologist who wants to respond to this naked act of economic aggression. I don't know. Yes, sir, go ahead.
I'm an IMF retiree, so I spent 25 years at the IMF, and I watched how the structural adjustment policy advice was adapted in response to changes in the global economy and at the World Bank as well. I'm wondering, what do the World Bank, the development banks, and the IMF think about about your body of work? Are they incorporating it? What grade would you give them on sensitivity to these kinds of issues?
I don't know if the World Bank is a big place. So I haven't figured out one World Bank message. maybe there is one that is subliminal and I don't see. So it's kind of, there are a lot of people at the World Bank who are doing exactly this type of work. In fact, they've established a whole unit that works with government to do exactly this type of work. In the IMF, I think their job description is a little different. So it's harder to imagine that they would incorporate experiment in setting monetary policy or austerity plans or things like that. And I'm much less aware of their day-to-day job, so I wouldn't comment on that.
Okay, so are we done? Okay, one more question. I see a hand waving. Which way? This way? Somebody's hand? Okay, go for it. Sorry, that was just random.
Thank you. So on the policy side, do you think that global redistribution, so like a globalized tax system, would be the most certain way to reduce poverty and perhaps the most fair way to implement or to fund universal basic income in poor countries?
If you've followed my work, you would see that I tend to be on the pragmatic step-by-step kind of thing, and I don't see this as one of them. It's not happening today, so I haven't been thinking about how one. It's too. At some level, it's too ambitious for me. Which doesn't mean, by the way, that someone shouldn't think about it. It's just that it's not my one little corner of the universe, which is much more kind of incremental.
So shall I just close up? You want to close up? Yeah. I just wanted to say goodbye to Esther because I haven't seen her in a while, and see you. I just want to say that you've been an inspiration to so many of us, especially to young economists. And I want to tell you in public that I find your work tough, provocative, and to me, extremely interesting in the truest sense of the word. And I think that the work you've done on randomized controlled trials, it shows, your deep and justified distrust with the way economic theory is done or the assumptions that we make. And your focus on things like misallocations, irreversibilities, behavioral issues, the nitty-gritty of all of this, along with the work you've done with Abhijit, along with what Abhijit has done and Michael has done, I think it just makes for a real contribution. So I just wanted to say that even though Robert Solow said that upward trajectories are limited, in your case, I don't think that's going to be. Okay? So thank you.
Thank you.